So welcome back, everybody. This is Night Flight, and today Lorgen is back, and we are going to talk about reptilian hosting, strip clubs, banks, and many more locations where you might not expect to be hosted. So, good to see you,
Yes.
Eve. Can you
That's fine.
believe that?
Yeah, it's
For a
good.
second, your name was gone. And how are you?
I'm good. I might be coughing with allergies, which is part of the norm now with all the, I call it the chemtrails, and that's
Mhm.
just normal now. And so I might cough and need a drink of soda in between. But I'm happy to be here. In fact, we were going to do this earlier and then I wasn't prepared and I hadn't slept well. And so I'm glad that we waited. Gave me a chance to review. It's actually one case, a woman. I don't like to call them cases, but it's a woman who was in the same state I am, who had an experience, and it actually wasn't reported to me until 2014 when I wrote the original. It was a two-part article. One of them was like reptilian hostings and strip clubs was the part one. And then part two was basically the update, which was an after interview where many other things were realized in this woman's life as a result of doing her healing and recovery and getting out of a toxic relationship and a family system and realizing how it is on the timeline of her experience in her life, that it all tied together in a certain way that is, I guess, how I want to present it. And one thing I will say too is that this has the quote, the giggle factor, or the weird, spooky, perverted thing that, people want to, laugh and giggle about reptilians and hosting and the weird sex strip club thing. But in reality, it's a predatory aspect of a particular non-human species working on this planet, in this realm, in a way that is harming humans and our society and our families. And so one of the interesting things about this woman's case when she came to me, and it wasn't just many people come to me because of the alien love bite, or they have a relationship with a false twin flame, or there's an entity attachment or whatever, but it went beyond the classic alien love bite. It was, she was married to a man for 23 years. So it was a 23-year marriage. And during really the last part of the marriage, she noticed the behavior of her husband got more robotic, more narcissistic, and he had a sex addiction, and he would frequent strip clubs where it would be the classic strip club where they would do the lap dances, or sometimes, private prostitution on the side, drinking bars, and not only one in the state where she went, where she, my same state, but I don't want to give you the city. But I guess he also went to a club, and I think it was in New Orleans, where once he started frequenting these strip clubs in this sex addiction, and it was after he got back from, I think, the New Orleans one, where something significantly changed in his energy field that showed that there was something going on that was weird and not right. So he became a little bit more robotic, more, well, he already had a splintered type of personality style of, let's say, someone who just didn't work on their trauma, and they have a low level emotional intelligence and are prone to being selfish, neglectful, and addictive in behaviors. And that was his personality style before he, quote, got hosted. So we know that there's a vulnerability of certain people. If they don't deal with their stuff and take personal responsibility, they become a threat not only to themselves, but the entire communities. And it's, I truly, this is where I stand, like, people must take responsibility for doing their own healing work, so they're not as, affected by these predatory species, which will harm people over time. And I
Yeah.
just had to put that in there as a therapist, because this is something that I think people can manage if they know the causes and conditions of the vulnerability. Okay. I just wanted to put that out there. So as soon as he had a more of a dramatic shift in the personality, she noticed that he was acting more robotic and a little more selfish and sexually addictive. And she's starting a meditation practice where she would do like prayers and meditation. And then when she would do that, he would get like suddenly angry and want to distract her and prevent her from doing meditation. He kept trying to say, no, don't do that. Stop it. Stop it. So it'd be like, why would you want someone to stop doing a meditation practice when it's really not harming anyone? It's just, creating her own balance and in her life, what she needed. So there was already an entity driving the to the disruption from a practice that could enhance our own perceptual abilities to perceive them. Okay, so there's always that interference factor going on. Like when you become aware, you'll start noticing things like that. So one of the things that she saw clairvoyantly, which I thought was interesting, was she saw what appeared like an iguana in almost a neon color outline. I think it was blue neon outline of an
I have
iguana.
an image of it.
Yeah, you could do the
I
screen
can
share
pull
if you
it
want.
up.
Yours might be
Yeah.
better than mine because there were several images that she did because she was an artist. Oops. There we
Okay.
go.
Yeah. And
Yes.
here's
So this is,
iguana.
yeah, she saw it as a lighter colored iguana that was, the neon blue outline on the right shoulder. And then where the real hosting overshadowing is taking place behind, and sometimes it's locked into, let's say, the solar plexus or the sexual chakra or other areas, it creates this dark greenish murky color that kind of overshadows the aura and the person. But what she saw connected with the iguana was like this white, kind of like a white square box. So that was perceived also clairvoyantly. And how she figured this out is that when she first saw the iguana and the white box on the shoulder, it was as if that was the first sign and symbol that this courting of the reptilian took place when he went to this strip club like in New Orleans. And so it's almost as if, okay, you do these activities in architecture that is linked in with real technology connected to reptilians and reptilian ships. Okay, that sounds bizarre, but when that technology allows an according to take place more easily, then the image of that interdimensionally in her psychic vision was like this white box on the shoulder, and then it was associated with the iguana, which was more like a symbol sign of the type of entity that was basically infecting the field and overshadowing him. But as time, yeah, so we don't have to see this image forever. I just want to move forward on the
Yeah,
next.
just have one question. Here
Okay.
is, do you see a little bit of, yeah, turquoise, the color? It's not really blue. It's not,
Yeah, she made it like,
is that like an energy field?
yeah,
Ah, okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But iguanas, those are actually real pets that some people have, and they're actually have a reptilian characteristic that's similar to female hormones. They actually can emit the same type of female hormones. I heard that from somebody who had like iguana pets, and it was like one of these things that was really weird. They have the same kind of pheromone thing as certain females, which is weird, but that's off topic. I'll continue with, because I want to take it in the direction in which she became aware of this entire process and how it on a timeline you could see how it fits together in hindsight, the whole operation. Because I think that's the important thing in hindsight, like, oh, okay, there's a reason for this whole thing, even throughout her childhood, what she discovered later in regression, shadow work, and doing her healing work. So, okay, so she observed, the husband acting more robotic, not right. Okay. And then this thing on his shoulder, his right shoulder. And then during sexual activity, she noticed that she saw the reptilian like overshadow, and he would be acting like really robotic during the sex act too, and then she would see it and feel it as it overshadowed his energy field, almost like a complete hosting during about 45 seconds of the orgasmic response of sexual activity. So it was like the being could immerse itself fully during that 45-second period of time, but then after that kind of had to jump out a little bit, but it was still kind of connected. And so she said that perceptually, when that full hosting took place, she could see the face of the entity and the whole thing kind of, and it's much larger than the body of her husband. Usually they're much larger and taller. And then but she couldn't see the face clearly when it was partially in and out, because it I don't know, it kind of masks itself when it's partially hosting. So that she felt the imagery of a clairvoyant's perception is much like this. I put an image on my website some years ago of a French healer named Stéphane Cardinaux, who could perceive how entities look overshadowing an energy field, and like the chakras they're holding on to with their hands, and how it looks to a clairvoyant. So she was saying, yeah, it looked just like how this guy drew these things out, where, the entity is coming from the behind and looking into the solar plexus and the sexual chakra, and is like way towering over his head. And so they control the will with the solar plexus and also the sexuality to make them sex addicted, because it'll activate that chakra even more in sex addiction. We know that. I mean, we know that with enough people that I've talked to who have that quality going on with a reptilian thing. So as she noticed this happening, it was so disturbing to her during that particular time where she saw the full hosting. From that point onward, she was like, didn't want to have sex with her husband anymore. And it was just, and then when the courting, it was almost as if when the courting was complete, and when, let's say, it's more strongly linked in the body, and she noticed a smell of her husband changing to like a bad smell. Like, I don't know if it was a pheromone, but it was like, it wasn't right. It smelled bad. It smelled wrong. It wasn't right. And it didn't, you could take a shower. It doesn't matter. A lot of times the smell that they actually leave, and I've heard this before from female people who've had the reptilian thing, that they'll actually do sounds so gross. Sometimes they do a spray and then they leave that smell on the woman or the person who's being hosted. There's like, and you can't get it out of your nose. It's one of these, I think it's a spirit thing too, that when someone has like a demon, a lot of times that demon has a smell. And just like saints and angels will leave like the smells of flowers and stuff. You'll see the opposite with like the darker, the reptilians. So as she
Just a side note, because you talked about courting. So some people, when they have a problem to let somebody go mentally, let's say it was a bad breakup and you have been really suffering, and then some people say, yeah, just mentally imagine the courting to that person and then cut it. Yeah, and do it again and again until there is really a sign of relief. So there are other people who suggest I wouldn't do that because the courting that way can grow back. What I would do is remove first your cord completely, yeah, without cutting it, yeah, and then add the other person. Would you say that is a good idea?
Well, I've heard different things with this particular woman. She actually did some energy work with a person who could help clear the field. Actually was willing to work on the husband if he was willing. And I think at first he was willing, but then he got rehosted because he wasn't willing to work on the psychological and the addiction aspect that made it so easy for him to get hosted. But when the healing process was taking place, she actually felt the clearing of her field and things being pulled out by the energy healer, and they didn't come back to the woman. But with the ex-husband or whatever who was hosted, he remained hosted because he really didn't want to work with his shit. Basically, he would, oh yeah, sure, heal me, yeah, I'll do it, but then not do the real work that caused him to be that way in the first place. So let's say if somebody's continuing an addiction and then really not doing the deeper, what's lying underneath the addiction, those behaviors or lack of, just being bad people. Or they're just not dealing with their shit, like a narcissist who refuses, well, they're going to stay hosted. Right. So if you try to remove entities of someone like that, it'll ping back to you, or it'll ping back to the person 7 times greater than the original, like the Bible says. So you can remove the cords from yourself if you're no longer having sex, let's say, with somebody who's hosted, or not engaging in the behaviors that will facilitate that process.
Mm.
So yeah, and I've heard it said both ways, where you see the cord and you cut it, you put like a white flower on the end and you send it back to them, and you pull it out and you burn it, or you like electrocute burn it. And there's different ways that people can be really creative about how they can clear themselves. And I think as long as you have the subtle awareness and the intention to clear yourself of these things and no longer engage in the how it happened, it'll go away. And it can go away with your own prayers, your own intentions, and your own work. You don't necessarily need someone to do this for you. And I
Yeah.
think it's dangerous now looking back.
I,
Um,
I would say I would prefer that to do it myself. I'm not saying that everybody who is doing energy work out there is a bad person, but you can also end up with more shit than you had before.
yes. Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And that's why I only do counseling and trauma recovery. And if people want to pray, that's fine. But I know I've gotten pingbacks and, numerous reprisals for doing radio shows or different things over the years. So there's that element of whenever you're disclosing things that are a little bit shady and dangerous, then you will be on the radar of those attacks. And it does happen. I hate to say it, but it does. So it's important for me to, how can I present this in such a way that I'm encouraging people to do the healing work and to continue that with confidence that they can overcome these things with positive integrity and virtues, and working on their stuff and having faith and applying your own abilities, and not being some whining victim and blaming people and getting all angry about it and just turning into a worse, narcissist than the host. Because I've seen that happen too, where people, they're not applying the knowledge correctly. So this has to be delivered in such a way that it inspires people to do their healing work and to get well and take responsibility, and not be on an angry blaming rant for every person that they think might be a reptilian host, you know. So
Yeah.
I had to say that because, you run a fine line in this particular field, I think,
Oh,
with
yeah.
the things that happen. Um,
Mm. So,
so,
why do you think strip clubs are a good venue for alien intervention?
well, what she saw, and this you could read on my website. I'll give you links later so you could read the whole write up of the part 1 and part 2.
I have
Um,
the link. I will put them in
oh,
the show. Yeah.
okay. Yeah. And there's actually an
I think
image.
I have an image for that as
Oh, yeah.
well.
Show the image and I could talk about it.
Hmm?
There might be a couple of them. One of them is like the funnel shaped thing. That's it's like an energy field. It's an interdimensional energy field. See, this funnel thingy almost looks like a TP. It's actually a shape, interdimensional thing that is over the building of the strip club, but it's partial interdimensional. But I think it ties in with how even the angles in the walls and the structure of the architecture of the building takes, it's important, right? It
That,
facilitates how it comes in. So it's like a funnel that comes in, and then like where, let's say, the prostitute was like, she saw it in her mind's eye. She was like remote viewing like what happened. And
mhm.
when I guess when the prostitute was lap dancing, and then where he opened up his energy field during an orgasmic servicing, his energy field opened up to the technology, like coming in more strongly over his energy field, and that the things that were in her energy field were basically being embedded into him. So all her stuff, like if you're a prostitute, you're going to take in a lot of bad energy, and then everybody in the strip club got corded, if they basically participated over time. And so all her stuff in her field would kind of be dumped into his. So you just basically garbage dump in your energy field, and then you get hosted. But then the cording is actually part of the interdimensional thing, which above that funnel in the next image, like she showed there was and I don't know how the words she used, it was like a duct system that she saw interdimensionally that kind of maybe work with the energy and the communication of actually a ship that was interdimensional over the building. Okay, so you actually having reptilian ships. So she saw a reptilian on the ship with like all these computers, where he's like watching all these different people who are being courted from that particular building or wherever they had their technology. So they're basically monitoring all the courted hosted people's behaviors and what they're doing. I mean, it's like one big peep show with these like reptilians like orchestrating all this stuff. But these weren't the only buildings that she saw that were affected by this type of interdimensional technology. So the strip club, would be, it's like the lower, sexual energy that, reptilians are, that's just their thing, right? So that would be an organized crime and just the lower energy addiction atmosphere. But it was also seen she saw it over a major bank that had a dome-like structure that would be the architecture of like a phallus, like a circumcised phallus. But the way that the architecture was designed, the ships would also be hanging out over those buildings, like banks and stuff, and then courting the people in there so that their consciousness would become more and more frequency matched with the reptilians and their agenda and their hive mind, and how they would compel people to be in certain states of consciousness and then just court them directly to host them. So in this hosting case, it was, I would say it had to do with more technology facilitating it, as opposed to, let's say, the old-fashioned method of just being a sex addict or, a split person who hasn't dealt with their trauma and they're a narcissist and then they're sex addicted, then they're just like open field for entities. So it just facilitated that more easily with the technology.
Yeah, here we have just the funnel over, let's say over the strip club.
Yeah.
Here we can see the waitress. And
Yeah.
this one, I guess, this is, here you see the ship.
Yeah.
Here you see the strip club. So actually, what is going on there is technological courting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What is this one, the white one?
She just seemed it was like a duct system that helped, maybe when energy moves from one form or dimension to another, it acts like a Fourier analysis transformation of that energy so it can go into the realm and the body of that dimension. So you might have it like coming from the ship and coming from these interdimensional realms, and then once it hits the physical realm, it has to like change its frequency so you can lock in to the bodies of the people or the architecture. So it looked like it came from underground, but I don't know if that's what she meant in that particular drawing, because she was seeing all this like interdimensionally in her third eye, basically, like remote viewing how this all worked together.
Yeah. And
so
is this some additional courting here that goes way out?
that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
It might even, I don't know if that's stars or underground. Like in the underworld, for example, you can have things come in from the underworld, like portals. So it could be an underworld kind of connection as well. Anyway, so that was, I think that was important because we know there's a technology that's facilitating so that when it took place, she definitely noticed not just a personality shift and a smell and the sex addiction thing and acting more robotic and almost uncomfortable in the, I've heard this before, in the lower body, let's say the solar plexus and below, or walking. Sometimes they would act clumsy, as if they don't really know how to operate the human body, like they're still a little clumsy like in the body. So I've heard this before with when they become fully hosted or when they're in that process, they can act a little bit clumsy and like emotional intelligence, like real stupid. And there was a thing where she noticed it was almost as if this is a concept that it sounds really dangerous and creepy, but if there's, let's say, a complete replacement from the original person and personality, then they might have a replacement thing going on, which is a little bit of a different, more dramatic possession. But there's a thing where she noticed his memories were stored differently in his mind. So she was basically kind of remote viewing and perceiving how his mental system was working, how his thought process was, how his memories were. And so when she did this thing where, let's say, normal in your normal everyday people do the same things, habits, she would deliberately did something out of habit on purpose to so that she came home earlier at a different time when he was home, well, I don't know, working in the garage or doing something at home. but because she came in and did something different, it caught him off guard, so that it was as if he was like another person who didn't even recognize her. And he had to, like, the program had to hurry up and get reinstalled with the memories to like fake it that, oh yeah, he's her husband, and that, oh, she just came home early or whatever. But it was like this moment of confusion, as if the memories had to get reshuffled to be like the husband again, because he's really not. Or it was that weird feeling that there was like a takeover of something else operating in the mind. So that's what was weird. So so anyway, she did, get eventually apply for, a separation and a divorce. She had, I think, 3 children who were affected by this. And then there was something going on. So she did like recovery work. Okay. So in part of her recovery work, she did some regressions to find out, because here's another aspect. She wanted to investigate how she felt she was sabotaged from finding her true twin flame, or the true healthy love relationship. So, and this is a common finding with my labs and abductees, where it's like they don't want these particular kinds of people or women to have a healthy, good relationship, because they're powerful people. They're very perceptive, and they're like reality creators. They're more powerful reality creators and influencers, actually. And this was proven, and this might have been the reason. Let me go back to her memory first. Okay, so in her regression, she wanted to find out, what is the causes, why these things happened, why did my husband get hosted, why I kept having, like, one of her first marriages was a marriage to a psychopath, so it was like a bad love bite, but that only lasted 2 years. And then the second marriage, thought it was okay, it turns out this guy's a fucking host. So like, what the hell's going on? So she couldn't remember anything, but she did do a regression, and what came up was something that when she was like an infant, she was only like 3 months old, and her mom had taken her to a daycare neighbor. So it wasn't like a facility, it was more like a private person's home who did daycare. So at this daycare, and what she saw and reacted in the memory, only a 3-month-old memory, this is pretty difficult to get, but there was a person who lived at the house who was in association with like a magician, black magic priest kind of thing, where the black magic priest came over one day during the babysitting and was trying to do some kind of weird ritual on her. And I don't know if there was a sexual abuse thing that happened, or what the attempt was with a ritual with her as a 3-month-old, but her higher self intervened during this process and caused it so that the priest really couldn't complete what he was wanting to do, and actually blew him down, like he fell over, like some powerful force intervened and literally stopped the process. But there was still a bit of a ritual and a bit of a trauma associated with that 3-month thing that seemed to, I don't know, set the stage for maybe a programming in her life to be captured by the satanic energies that, for one reason or another. But when I look at her qualities as a human being and as a woman, she would be like I don't know if she was a starfire, and that's just a name we're using, but somebody who obviously has a quality that is a cut above, okay, with respect to perception, with respect to actually power of reality creation. And this was proven.
What did you call that? Star?
Okay, we used to call it starfire blood, which is actually a bloodline thing that some of the quote Illuminati bloodline people will want to control through mostly women, and it's associated with a lot of the women female blood, menstrual blood, that has more power in it, and with certain genetic bloodline people. So men can have it too, but the women are highly sought after during their menstruation days, because the menstrual blood has a high level of power in it for these like blood-sucking friggin' Satanists. So that's why it's like, it's a crazy thing, but they notice that, okay, there's something real to this. And so they know before the woman knows, or the person knows, like, what is it about me? Why do they keep doing this shit to me? It's like, hey, I just want to live a simple life. They're not out publicly. They're like a nobody. And they're like, they have all these weird experiences. So, so it could have been.
Starfire, I know. And it also has to do with the Anunnaki. And they did that big time. It was also part of forced breeding. that women were, practically chained to the wall, and then they got them pregnant again and again and again until they died. And once their beloved goddess
Oh, yeah.
was no longer available, they collected this so-called starfire, the menstrual blood from human women. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty
It's
creepy.
really disgusting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but even after they stop menstruating, they're still powerful in themselves, like in terms
Mm.
of psychic abilities and reality creation. And so anyway, as she went through this divorce process, it was extremely traumatic. Okay. I mean, she tried to go through healing, not only to remove the cords, because she was actually becoming anemic from being energy vampirized. So this was a serious, get exhausted around these hosts because that they also take your energy. So she was dealing with the health issues, the trauma of all of that, and trying to just navigate herself out of the relationship. But as part of, in hindsight, okay, after she realized all these things, because when you're in the midst of trauma, a lot of times you can't see clearly, let's say, the cause and effect of things that were going on in your past and your present and in your community, for example. So this the second part of this article, I don't know if we can go on. She seemed to.
Before we do that, I have one more question. She described, she said about her husband, the one that was hosted by a reptilian. She said about him, he was not a psychopath, but he had a splintered personality, or a splintered self. Yeah, splintered self. That was the term that she used. So, what is that exactly, a splintered self?
Well, that's a good question. I think, I mean, as a therapist, what happens in early trauma, we will get dissociation, splits, or fracturing, and it could be in different degrees. Like in a serious case, you would get what they call a trauma split, dissociative identity disorder, where they might literally have a split off personality that's associated with the trauma that holds the memory and the emotion of that trauma, while the host person who's being protected from feeling that just to survive is just like the regular personality. And then there may be switching going on in between when they get triggered to some similar situation or emotion. So being partially splintered, I don't know if he was a full MPD, but it's just that they're not very aware of their past traumas and the cause and effect of how they reacted and the part they basically shut down. So a lot of times what's driving an addiction is the splintered trauma that hasn't been resolved, recovered, or dealt with in therapy. So it will drive addictions because of the bad feels of that, the alter that's holding it, or the inner child, for example.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have that kind of thing going on in varying degrees. So what I see this a lot where some cultures it's just normalized with multi-generational abuse or alcoholism in the family, pedophilia, incest, and it goes one generation to the next without people healing. So, and that makes it worse. But there's a lack of understanding, I think. I don't know, in many cultures, maybe some of the more misogynistic cultures, let's say, don't have a good grasp on it, and they facilitate and enable predators and misogyny and the continued abuse with. And she actually saw this as part of the programming that was part of these constellation of archetypes within the reptilian programming of the sexual thing, was like an S&M, in her case, the male would take the domineering, sadist role, was the woman would be treated with disrespect and beaten and submission and that kind of thing. So that was the arc. She called it the constellation of archetypes programming in those sexual deviant behaviors. Okay, so it would be a lot like, remember in that movie, The Shades of Grey, where I think that was total programming. It was a good movie. It was,
I never saw that movie. It
oh
doesn't
my God.
interest me for 5 cents.
Well, that's programming, because what is basically, it shows that, okay, early abuse can affect a personality such that they're going to act out this rage and hatred in a sexually sadistic way, where you have like a love-hate, a sex addiction with the original perpetrator, which might have been a mother figure who was an addict or an abuser, but then turn around and act it out because it's unrecovered trauma with deviant sexual behaviors. But in the movie, they're basically making like, oh, well, he can't help it. This poor Christian Grey had he was adopted and his mother was an abuser. Well, let's just feel sorry for him. And, if he has enough love and you just let him, treat you like crap in a sadomasochistic freaking reptilian hosted sexual fucking thing, it'll be all okay. And that was the programming. Like, well, if you just love him enough and let him do these things for sexual pleasure, that he'll just somehow get well. Like, I
That
don't think.
is so dangerous.
So that's what I
Thinking
will.
that
You know,
anyhow, if you think I have to save this person, you have to question yourself.
and that's
You
part of
can
the
give
program.
advice, you can give assistance, yes. But as long as somebody does not want to save himself, there is nothing that you can ultimately do.
And that's absolutely true. And that's probably what we called her M, the initial M, found out in her case, where a lot of them are empaths. The artists, the empaths, we end up getting, let's say, connected with a narcissist host, and part of it is the complementary trauma thing that happens when you haven't fully recovered from the trauma yourself, and you're on the codependent empathic end, and then you'll attract to yourself those predators. So the healing has to take place. Usually it happens on the codependent side first. And then they realize, oh, and then they'll want to heal their partner. It's, it's their husband, the father of their child. And, let's just love them enough and maybe they'll heal. Let's find a healer for you to take your entity, like, oh, so you think they're going to do the work psychologically so that they stay unhosted? No, they're going to stay sex addicted. They're going to keep their dumb belief systems of misogyny and unresolved trauma because they don't deal with their shit. Because they don't think they should have to, because after you've already adopted the personality style of a narcissist, I will say that it is unlikely. And that, and even in a biblical sense, you would see that personality type, that's what you call unrepentance. So an unrepentant person who has demons, and you're going to be stupid enough to try to remove their entities, what do you think is going to happen to you and them after you might successfully take it out? It'll come back to you, and it'll come back to them worse. And so we have to see the connections between how and why this happens and what drives addictions and what is the power running it, like the reptilians, and facilitating trauma. So people have a compartmentalized view of what they think is the cause and effect of even, reptilians and hosting, or, why these things take place and how to really reduce our vulnerability to this predation. And that's where I think, with psychology and, the emotional intelligence has to be part of the recovery education. And many narcissists and borderlines and hosted people and those who are in places of control deliberately or in mind control positions to maintain the narrative of whatever institutions that are, let's say, encouraging a particular cherry-picked spin, right? Well, they won't deal with it. They want to hide it. Their job is to hide and enable the predators. And this is what the hierarchy system, family controlled people, and the psychopaths in politics, not all of them are psychopaths, but you know what I mean. We've mentioned this before. It's reinventing the wheel in terms of causes and conditions. But this is why the component of recovery from trauma and emotional intelligence and self-responsibility and knowing the connections between how and why someone becomes more and more corrupted and hosted and dangerous must be understood, so that we could come in and deal with the responsibility that we can do to change it. And I know that you know that as a woman, but I could tell you that I've spoken to many people who they might know some of the truths about, the reptilians or the UFOs or some of the bad shit in politics or the sex trafficking, but they still haven't been able to go from A to B, C, D, E, E, or F or whatever. They only have a compartmentalized view, and they don't get the whole thing. And they don't value, it's about value of emotional intelligence and value of, women and men equally. So if there's a devaluation and a sadomasochism, whatever you call it, I can't say that word, but it's the programming of the archetypes, which she identified later in the second part. She goes into a deeper dive into understanding the, wow, you know, how and why this happens. And in fact, I could even pull it up and just read the bullet points on the part 2, because it was done in a nice way. Okay, I'll just read it. Oh, well, let me
Yeah.
do a screen share. I can do a quick
You
screen share.
can do a screen share. Yes.
Hold on.
The green button.
And it's just there. Here we go. Why is it desktop? Okay, let's see if it works. Excuse me if it's messy. Oh, come on. Why is it doing? Is it not working?
No, I don't see any. I see you. Yeah.
You know what? Let me just read it. It's 1, 2, 3, 6 bullet points of things that she later realized and deeper insights as to how and why all this happens together. And you can read the article. It's a long one, but okay. The reality of the UFO. Well, now they're going to call it UAP, by alien archontic technologies used to manipulate, cord, or host a person with reptilian entities. For example, the white holographic box linked to the iguana image was an example of that. And then we could extend this to, let's say, banks, strip clubs, social and mental health services, green technologies, Trojan viruses to implement more controlling and harmful technologies and agendas. And we are already seeing that today with a lot of this climate thing and green technologies, but we'll go into that later in the second part. Okay, what she called the constellation of archetypes, that is a part of the programming going on into strip clubs. This includes negative father figure archetypes, deviant sexual behavior, disrespect for the feminine, and normalization of these falsehoods into the mass consciousness. And I would add a little side note here that on some of these strip club little sex game places, they will do a thing where, oh, the woman will dress up like a teenager or a little girl with pigtails, and they would play these little fantasy games. But a lot of times what they're doing is they're enabling the pedophile kind of thing, where instead of an adult woman with an adult male, they become younger and younger and younger. And part of that is the programming. And in fact, James Bartley had done a whole article on reptilian astral dreamscape manipulation and how they program. Once they get a hold of someone, they'll actually try to program them and engineer them into pedophilia itself, as well as deviant and violent sexual behavior. We know this. This will happen with a lot of the porn as well. So I just had to put in a side note there, because we know that the whole pedophilia thing is the root cause and form of the predation that they're doing in these, human trafficking, for example. So, okay, number 3 or 4 bullet point is psychic attacks when you reveal the truth, night terrors, dream hacks of repetitive negative control, perversions, violence, and mockery themes. This will happen in the dreams for sure. People, once there's a reptilian, invading your dreamscape or working through a host. Attack on the loved ones to be manipulated or even hosted as reprisals for your spiritual truth and emerging awareness. And indeed, I believe this is actually the case with this particular woman when she became aware of something locally. We'll talk about that in the second half. Heightened attacks before or to prevent meeting one's true twin flame partner or a healthy, respectful, loving relationship, okay? Psychological and behavioral traits of the hosted persons who she notices are overshadowed by the lizard type entities, including the changes that took place in her husband after he got courted to this entity and the technologies. So let's see, deeper insights. And there was one part I wanted to make a note of before we go to the second. Okay, psychic attacks. Negative father figure. We kind of talked about that. She said these forces of the negative father archetype and sexual programming. She thinks these happen more with narcissistic personality or psychopathy. It seems like that psychopaths may be bodies where the soul did not come in fully, or where it left for some reason, and the demonic or reptilian entities came in and took the body over fully. I think that's true. She felt that the overshadowing, that they were emotionally void or very cold with no empathy and sadistic, and you could feel the hatred and the contempt coming through them. And actually I've seen this in draconian hosted people as well, not just a reptilian. There's different kinds. Okay, so she noticed the attachments, chakra location cords. We can go over that later. There's one that I wanted to go through: interdimensional technology in the room. Oh God, there's so much more here, but oh yeah, the growling. She noticed that people who had reptilian hosting, they might have like growling going on. Like if they're in a bad mood, they just kind of like growl and kind of act more. That's really strange, but I have heard that in more than one or two cases. Okay, this is the one that I've seen and in others, and it's an unfortunate thing that can happen in the whistleblowing communities. And what she saw is the understanding of other evil people and what makes them tick. And I'm just going to read what she said. She said, people that are reptilian hosts can have an uncanny, matter of fact, understanding of the evil in other human beings and how it is likely to play out. From what I have observed, they are aware of other people that are also hosted or likely or possessed too. And then I put in a side note of this Susan Reed book called The Body Snatchers. She talks about the interdimensional and physical networking system of reptilian hosts in physical bodies, right, who engage in all manner of targeting abuse towards persons they are told to neutralize, disrupt, or kill. And this is in the Susan Reed book, where she actually talked about, and it was a whole expose, and James Bartley did the review about her book, and she came to us years ago, like before she even wrote the book, and the whole thing was about, you know, this reptilian host boyfriend who was abusing her and how she got away from him. And she had SRA history and Monarch programming, MK Ultra as well. So she was being handled by a reptilian hosted boyfriend and got away from him. So part of her, you know, whistleblowing book was about how that all took place. But what was kind of creepy, and I reread some of the interview about the guy who was the reptilian hosted boyfriend. Like apparently in his history before he became a host, he had gotten abducted, a classic, I guess it was a reptilian UFO abduction where he was physically taken when he was a teenager or 20 years old. It was a young age. And then that where they literally did a replacement. So he went in one way and came out another. And this actually happened in one of the cases in my Dark Side of Cupid book, where it was a female, and she was only 24 years old. And then after she got taken, it was another type of entity that did, actually, I think it was a full possession. And that's in my book. I'll just make a side note here. It's the one in my Dark Side of Cupid called The Case of Andrea and Brian. And so this was actually one of Barbara Bartholick's early cases. Anyway, so I'll just go back from what I was reading. It's just that I made the connection that in the more severe cases, you can actually have a complete replacement thing going on following a physical event. If the trauma and whatever conditions are present, they can do this. And I think this happens in some of the cases you really won't hear about, like the one that James and I, the Susan Reed case. She was like in a satanic ritual abuse, mind-controlled family system. Okay, so she was set up from childhood to be, you know, handled and programmed. And so that's why her boyfriend was a reptilian host. And so she basically discovered all this, did a lot of healing work, got away from him, and then turned. It was such an interesting case because it shows these families, okay, let's say they're mostly practicing Black magicians who will have what we call familiar spirits, but they're, in her case, it was a reptilian familiar, which is like an entity that will work with you interdimensionally to act like a spy and a handler and an influencer of everybody in that person's life, that they basically handle them that way. So she got the reptilian who was handling him somehow to get away from him so she could escape. It was quite an interesting story, how she discovered all this working together with technology and with people who are known hosts, and they know they're hosted. So they're the ones who have all that knowledge. They know more details than maybe a researcher about, well, how evil someone is, for example, and how they really work. And so they could come in like an expert in the whistleblowing testimony and be a takes one to know one kind of example of like, oh, like, holy moly, they are really good copycatters and counterfeiters of very detailed, accurate information. So I have to put that out there because it's very unfortunate, but I've seen this enough times to be like, wow, this is something to just take a note of. That just like in a AA, my sister one time was going to AA and because she had an issue, right? But a predator went into the AA meeting full well, not just an alcoholic, but a predator who did, I think, homicide and rapes kind of thing. And he would predate on the weaker people who are working in the recovery. A lot of them are like borderline, they're trauma, they're sex abuse victims. That's why they're freaking alcoholics. And then predate on them as the boyfriend who's like helping out in AA. And then they're like the predators who would infiltrate like healing communities or social service agencies or whatever, right? So that kind of thing happens. And this
So
is
what
what
I sorry.
noticed. No, that's what she noticed very strongly. Like, oh, on top of it all, there's the ones who see it. And then let's say the first time you want to share your story with someone who seems like, the expert, the cryptozoologist expert on reptilians, and they're a friggin' host, and then you're like, holy shit, you just endangered yourself. So that's why when somebody's going into recovery, they must be very careful with who they disclose to and try to be as thorough in their recovery process before you go whistleblowing or telling things in public. I would say be careful based on the people I've got hurt that way. Yeah.
So would you say that sexual deviance is a tool for destroying the spiritual potential of human sexuality, and that is exactly what is needed by the reptilian?
Yeah, I would say so. Because the energy behind them, when you could feel it, when it's working through them, yeah, any remote viewer probably can do this too. All they do is like tune in, and then you feel what they really feel in their heart, and you get it. Like, oh, what's behind them is this hatred, rage, contempt, and desire to do sexual harm and violence to a woman because of an extreme hatred. It's almost like a love-hate thing that's functioning in their psyche, and it's unresolved. A lot of times it's unresolved trauma, but then it's an entity thing because they have natural envy and contempt for humanity, and a lot of it especially directed towards women and sexual violence, but towards children too, because we see this in when they do trauma-based mind control. This is what's not spoken in a lot of these whistleblowing things, is that the very basis of trauma-based mind control to create mind-controlled slaves, and even in the secret space program, for example, or a super soldier, the primary way to split trauma someone is through sexual abuse as children between infancy and 6 years old, for sure. Usually between 0 and 3 years old, you have a severe sexual abuse incident that creates a split in the child, and so that will be carried with them. And one of the unfortunate things with sex abuse, sometimes they do this with females or males, where they'll force and manipulate an orgasmic sexual response in the young child to have the get turned on basically, or learn how to masturbate early in life as a result of being molested and sexually abused. And then the association with the sexual orgasmic response with the original perpetrator in a very conflicting emotional love, hate, rage, sexual desire, and it just screws up the sexual orgasmic response association in the brain with the negative emotions. And so that's where I think doing spiritual liberation work can help heal that and take away those ingrained programs that are actually, they're in the brain. They're like like have to reroute the neural pathways and how this is split. But I believe those therapeutic modalities are available and that actually can be done, and that people can recover from these kinds of associations in the brain and physiological responses. But you have to be willing to do the recovery. Yeah.
So, Eve, thank you so much. That was our first hour already. It went by like wee. And yeah, we see you all next time. This is the public hour, and we will see the patrons